Talking about the evolution of the Ultima games is like talking about the entire history of video games, especially computer RPGs. The Ultima games were for a long time in history the pinnacle of world building, gameplay choices, and character development in games. For a while I wanted to start a series here in the channel talking about the history of video games, something I'm deeply fascinated about, and Ultima instantly came to mind. There's so much for us to talk about, from the origins of the franchise, the evolution of the series, spanning more than 10 games in total across the main series and spin-offs, as well as the influence of Ultima all around the world in multiple game genres. So buckle up, because this is gonna be the first episode of a brief history of video games, a new series here on the channel, and it's gonna be very fun. Hey guys, it's Harry. I've been a game designer and producer for the past 10 years, and here in the channel we cover a lot of stuff from game production to the games market itself, and now a little bit of history of video games. So if you enjoy the content, leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's talk about Ultima. The Ultima series was created by Richard Garriot, the designer that would be known as Lord British, one of the first true authors in the games industry. We all recognize Nintendo's legendary designers Shigeru Miyamoto or Hideo Kojima or Todd Howard, but Lord British was really one of the first, if not the first, designer in video games history to have a strong vision, high ambition, and a keen sense of authorship in games. The actual first game that he designed was Aalabath, World of Doom, in 1979, during his high school years, so that was pretty early in the industry. A game that would be later known as Ultima Zero when it was ported to the PC and re-released in 1997. Aalabath was really a personal project more than anything. Like Lord British said himself, "I had been working for my own enjoyment and edification, not my dinner." A project that he worked on during his high school years but saw unexpected success after it was published by California Pacific on the Apple II computer, the computer that became one of the obsessions of Garriott. While most games at the time had only text-based gameplay, Aalabath had a mix of a top-down view on the world map and a first-person view in the dungeons, which looked much richer and enticing than its competitors. That grabbed a lot of attention from players and opened the eyes of Garriott for more ambitious endeavors soon to come. Ultima 1: The First Age of Darkness was released in 1981, also by California Pacific. The game was initially only available for the Apple II, but later ported to the Atari 8-bit computer and several other systems as well. The Apple II computer was the go-to system for game developers in those days, because it had better graphical features than its competition, like the IBM. Garriott was a big fan of the system, and his first many games were developed with the AppleSoft BASIC language, used to code in the Apple II. The game used a system of 26 commands, meaning that each key on a keyboard had a function in the game that you could only discover either by trial and error or reading instructions elsewhere, like the game manual, because the game itself didn't have any kind of tutorial like we expect nowadays. Back in the day, it was nothing like today, when you can develop a game in accessible game engines like Unreal, Unity, or Godot, and have your game easily published on several different platforms at the same time. In those days, if you wanted your game running on a different system, you'd have to basically program it again in a different language. Garriott himself recognized that he was late in identifying that the Apple II would lose relevance to the later IBM systems and the MS-DOS, which cost him a lot of momentum during the transition while other developers were catching up quicker. But Lord British went really ambitious with Ultima 1 and wanted to introduce a game experience that dwarfed even his previous title. So Ultima 1 presented a very bold concept that took the player from the Middle Ages all the way to the Space Age, even featuring a first-person flight combat, which marveled critics and players at the time. It was something unimaginable and truly remarkable. Even today, the idea of a game spanning such a long period of time in gameplay is a crazy challenge. Naturally, games like Civilization did it masterfully throughout history, but Civilization 1 released in 1991, 10 years after the release of Ultima. So you can see how incredible of a feat it was for a game in the 80s to do that. I have to admit that I didn't play Ultima back in the day because I grew up in the 90s instead of the 80s, but getting to play the Ultima games now was like entering a time machine and it gave me the chance to really appreciate the small and big details that we usually take for granted in modern games. But also the remarkable thing to notice is that most of the conventions that we take for RPGs and computer games were already there for Ultima 1. Choosing your character class, spending points and attributes, going to vendors to purchase weapons and armor, all of it is there. And naturally there was a clear influence of Dungeons and Dragons, of which Lord British was a great fan, like so many other people at the time. But Ultima possessed a sense of immersion and choice that hooked thousands and thousands of players. Ultima 1 sold more than 50,000 copies at the time, an outstanding number for a game made by one person before the mainstream internet era during his college years. The game was a massive success that catapulted Garriot's reputation across the industry and would be the first, or actually the second installment in a series that is one of the most important in video games history. A few years after Ultima 1's release, Garriott regained the rights of the game that were with California Pacific and was able to rewrite it in the assembly language to release it under his newly founded company, Origin Systems, in 1986. There are 3 trilogies of games that are the main line of the Ultima series, from Ultima 1 to 9, plus Aalabath that is today regarded as Ultima 0. And it really was Ultima 0 because even the dungeon code Garriott wrote for Ultima 1 was actually Aalabath's code. It would be one of the centerpieces for the new game. All of it set in the world of Sosaria, the main environment for the series, and the Kingdom of Britannia, ruled by Lord British, that would become the alias for Garriott himself, which he does all the time, including names and references of real people into his games, mostly including himself, not only personifying Lord British, but also King Shamino, that was one of Garriott's codename in college. Also, there were many spin-offs that sprung from Ultima, including Ultima Underworld 1 and 2, and a very rare and controversial Ultima Escape from Mount Drash, published by Sierra Online in 1983, which is nonetheless a valuable game for collectors because of how rare it is to be found in the market. Even Japanese RPGs were heavily affected by the influence that Ultima generated, including Dragon Quest and one of my all-time favorites, Final Fantasy. That can be easily noticed, for example, in Final Fantasy's original combat system, with 4 characters in your party and a time limit per character turn. That mechanic was present in Ultima 3, released in 1983, 4 years before Final Fantasy. Actually, that combat feature was already seen in Wizardry, one of Ultima's strongest competitors and another RPG classic, which deserves a video of its own. Oh, and by the way, are you enjoying the history of Ultima so far? Then let me know in the comments below what other games you'd like to see here on the channel. I'd love to keep making episodes like this one. Each of the Ultima games built directly on their predecessor, taking the player to the Kingdom of Britannia as the Avatar. Not the one from the James Cameron movie, but an unnamed hero fighting the evil forces of the wizard Mondain in the first Ultima and several other villains across the franchise. Ultima 3 Exodus cemented Richard Garriot as one of the finest makers of RPG in history, a master of the genre, a veritable J.R.R. Tolkien of the keyboard, according to one magazine reviewer from the 80s. Ultima 3 brought important innovations not only in the 4-character party combat, but also bringing a full roster of 11 character classes for the player to choose, 16 weapon types, 32 magic spells, and instead of the randomly generated dungeons from before, Ultima 3 had fixed, stable dungeons that were much more meaningful and relevant for gameplay. The Ultima series also developed an incredible space of possibilities when it came to player choice and agency, each one developing more and more freedom of choice and action. The later games in the series, like Ultima 6, allowed you to even grind wheat to make bread and sell it on the market. And everything became more interactable throughout the series, like your ability to move static objects around, sit on any chair, play any instrument that you find in the world, and much more. And to that effect, Ultima Online, an MMORPG that was set in the same universe, which is 28 years old and still has a solid community and player base, expanded on that concept to allow you to really live in a virtual world, where you can build your own house and furniture and venture across the seas in a truly massive world, even for today's standards. And one of the main reasons for that was that Lord British was always fascinated by the role aspect of role-playing games, more than the min and maxing of stats and rules. That became more evident as the series moved forward, particularly with Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar, where the series made a substantial turn for a more story-driven and even philosophical approach to RPGs. Starting with how you create your own avatar, and by the way, Ultima 4 was the first one to actually call your character the Avatar. But now instead of choosing your character class and distributing points and stats, you have to answer a series of questions about moral dilemmas that will really determine what your character is. A pretty unique concept at the time. There were even associations of Richard Garriot to Tolkien, given such important and incredible worlds he created and how influential they were and still are to the whole medium. How much that impact will stand the test of time like Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings did is yet to be seen, but some solid 36 years after the release of Aalabath and Lord British is still a massive influence, so we're on a good track. Naturally, the process of developing a game changed massively during those last decades when Garriott was actively developing the Ultima games. He would code the games mostly by himself, and in the earliest days even writing the code on a notebook before transferring it to the computers. Imagine how limited and raw were the development tools in those times, not the marvels that we have today when you can even tell an AI to build a game for you. But while today you usually get some quality of life features like the ability to quickly create random characters or finding some pre-built characters along the journey with their interesting personalities and side stories, here in Ultima 3 you had to create and name each character before venturing forth, which is of course very understandable, being one of the first experiences to present that option for the player. Many times when we think about those old games, we complain about how bad the user experience is, but we have to remember that for those games, any new feature was a breakthrough. So the designers are almost always not exactly thinking about quality of life features, but instead just making sure that those features are possible at all. For example, Ultima 3 makes you create a whole party of characters, 4 in total, but you need to create each one separately, in a very laborious process. But if you transfer yourself back in time, imagine that it is the first time in computer history that it is possible at all to create a full party of characters in an RPG. You can really feel like a D&D party playing the tabletop game. So that's the sentiment here. Quality of life features come over time, as we'll see throughout the franchise and other games. Seeing the difference between Ultima 1 and 2's combat to Ultima 3 is really remarkable because we can see the evolution not only of the RPG genre, but really the entire industry right there in a single franchise. It's kinda like following the journey of Link across the Zelda games, all the way from the pixelated 2D art, even somewhat similar to the early Ultima games, to the latest installments in all of the evolved designs and concepts of combat, crafting, and storyline along with it. In a period when so few games were in the market, each one acted as a direct influence to the others, so every new designer wanted to build on top of the foundations being established by the other titles. This created many rivalries and a direct sense of competition among the authors that we as players need to be very grateful for. For Ultima 3, instead of publishing it under California Pacific like the previous games, Garriott went on to create his own publishing company, Origin Systems. Ultima contains a lot of the rich concepts and definitions that an RPG player would expect, including different character classes like fighter, cleric, wizard, and thief, fantasy races like human, elves, dwarves, and even bobbits, to make sure that you don't lose the reference to Lord of the Rings, and a full bestiary of monsters for you to slay among giant bats, bears, cyclops, orcs, and even a Balron, winged monsters carrying a vicious barbed whip, quote unquote. Once again, in case you lost a reference. Oh yeah, and let's not forget the gelatinous cube, a jelly-like monster that can corrode your entire armor. So yeah, even that will become somewhat of a trend across CRPGs to not take themselves too seriously and add some silly and humorous components. Fallout and Wasteland are two classic series that adopted it in their core essence. Ultima 4 through 6, also called the enlightenment era of the series, saw a lot of visual, narrative, and gameplay improvements to the franchise. While the story of Ultimas 1 to 3 was very limited and basic, even referred to as the Dark Ages of Britannia in the subsequent installments, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar started to develop a more intricate, nuanced, and even philosophical storyline. Ultima 4 was released in 1985 by Origin Systems and later regarded by computer gaming world as the second best game of all time for the PC. It was indeed a massive turn from a more hack-and-slash approach to more cultural and social conflicts, incentivizing the player to reflect on questions about good and evil. One of the most unique features of Ultima 4 was that instead of rolling dice or spending points to decide the attributes of a character, you would meet a fortune teller that would ask you moral questions, and based on your answers, it defines the philosophical inclinations of your character and then their class and stats. This was a revolutionary concept that was highly copied by other games. If the first 3 installments in the series represented Garriott mastering the craft of making games, Ultima 4 Quest of the Avatar represented a more mature approach to development, when Garriott would think about hidden meanings and symbols in the game and what they should represent. At the time, he received a lot of mails with players trying to explain symbols in his first games that didn't really exist, or bigger questions that weren't there. So this time around, Lord British decided to intentionally include them in the game, writing more existential quests, deeper storylines, and something for the players to really think about instead of just slaying monsters. As a developer, he felt more responsibility with the players, as more and more of them were becoming raving fans of the series and spent dozens and hundreds of hours playing the Ultima games. And that was the sparkle for a series of decisions and improvements that would change not only Ultima itself, but the way people saw games and what they could be forever. This is why it's so incredible to revisit these types of game franchises, because we realize that the way we think about games today was built over time, brick by brick, one game after the other, exploring different concepts, trying to move the needle of game mechanics, graphics, narrative, and most importantly, the meaning of all of it. From the earlier times when games explored simple fantasies of heroes, might and magic, 3 very interesting words that can be a whole nother video, to much more complex and deep stories that traverse all aspects of human life and dilemmas. Games can talk about love and loss and revenge and self-esteem and belonging and everything else that we can think of. Games are an incredible and deep medium, and one of the first times in history that was explored was when Richard Garriot wrote Ultima 4, Quest of the Avatar. That gives me goosebumps. It's like the film industry in the 1930s and 40s, starting to explore everything that films could represent and how impactful they could be. Now we gamers have a medium that is as impactful as films, in some aspects even more. Going back to the timeline, Ultima 6, The False Prophet, was released in 1990 and it marked the end of the Age of Enlightenment trilogy for the series. It was released for the MS-DOS instead of the Apple II, marking the end of an era for the Apple computer games. The new PC systems came with new VGA cards, which made possible a huge leap in graphical quality on the screen, with now 256 colors that became the new standard in the industry. It's amazing to see how not only the graphics evolve with each Ultima, but the user experience, interface, narrative depth, and the details of the world. It's really like seeing the history of computer games unfold at each installment. The player interface has changed quite a lot this time around, allowing diagonal movement to the player and more interactivity on screen with the mouse. The list of 26 commands was now overhauled, giving room to a menu with 10 icons for a more streamlined experience. In character creation, the game continued to present the moral questions for you to answer in order to decide your character class, with the fortune teller performing the test of the 8 virtues as you answer the questions in an animated cutscene for the first time in the series. From pretty much non-existent cutscenes to more and more refined ones, Garriott always tried to leverage the best out of each computer system, their graphical capabilities, and his own skills as a storyteller. The interesting detail to capture in Ultima 6's intro cutscene is that it provides you a narrative hook right there even before the main menu appeared. You, the avatar, are back on Earth thinking about your companions in Britannia. Suddenly, a red portal appears at your doorstep and the character enters it. Where does it lead? What new mysteries await you? Those subtle narrative decisions were only possible and present as Garriott developed his skills as a developer. The first games were simply about being able to have any kind of narrative at all, but the more mature Ultima games tried to bring new questions for the player to reflect on, better plot development, and more subtle nuances. But if Ultima 6 was already very well received by critics and players, Ultima 7 would become a new pinnacle of quality when it came to PC games and RPGs. And that is something truly remarkable about the entire Ultima series. With each new installment, it looked like Garriott was able to deliver better and better games, more acclaimed than their predecessor, expanding on the world and the franchise itself. That is no small achievement even for today's standards. So many game franchises that start amazing lose quality, focus, and development in its sequels, and most succumbed after a few installments. But Ultima kept aiming higher and higher and achieving new standards for quality. That is definitely another of the reasons that put Richard Garriot as one of the finest craftsmen of video games to ever live. Ultima 7 The Black Gate was released in 1992 and it presented the player with the most sophisticated storyline, character development, interface, and world building that the series had ever seen. You were now able to play the game entirely with a mouse, which was something unthinkable at the time, but well recommended in the game's manual. The environment was remarkably rich and interactive, allowing you to explore and interact with almost every object in the game, making the player want to uncover every corner of Britannia, its villages and dungeons. The NPC characters in Blackgate are more developed than probably any other game at the time. They walked around, minding their own businesses, their own routines, even going to bed at night. Putting as much depth and interactivity as possible was always Garriot's goal, but now he was starting to achieve it in a way never experienced before. Ultima 7 had two expansion packs, Forge of Virtue later in 1992 and Serpent Isle in 1993. But then once you fly too close to the sun, you end up burning your wings. And after 15 years since the release of Aalabath, after so many incredible games and industry-defining role-playing experiences, Ultima 8 Pagan started the fall of the mainline series. Pagan tried to be more in line with more modern games, so it allowed you to run, jump across platforms, climb, and overall presented a much larger range of physical challenges. That, combined with a buggy release and even its controversial title, rendered much more criticism than praise this time around. That didn't get any better with Ultima 9 Ascension, released in 1999, which also faced an even buggier launch, more focused on frantic mouse clicking even than Ultima 8, and for the first time a fully 3D world in third-person perspective, which was indeed a graphical improvement, but it didn't land very well on the fans of the series. And so ended the mainline games of Ultima, from Aalabath to Ascension, a full journey throughout the history of video games. But that is not all, no. Ultima Underworld: The Stygian Abyss was a spin-off, first-person dungeon crawler with fluid motion in a 3D world even before Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were thinking of coming into existence. Underworld was released in 1992 and was not developed by Origin but rather by a small studio from New Hampshire called Blue Sky Productions, which partnered with Origin to bring the elements of Ultima into the engine. The game brought many innovations to the genre, including not only 360 movement and a fluid combat system that changed your character's attack based on mouse position, but it was also the first to bring a very iconic concept. On screen, it displayed two potions, one red for your health and one blue for your mana, which would be adopted by a very successful franchise of heroes, angels, and devils. Ultima Underworld: Labyrinth of Worlds was a direct sequel to the Stygian Abyss and released in 1993. The spin-off series wasn't nearly as successful as the mainline games were, but they were nonetheless very important for the technological advancement of the first-person genre, including id Software's games like we mentioned before. Alright, after a Moongate trip across Britannia and the Ultima games from Rise to Fall, there's just one more game I'd like to talk about. It's a game that is 28 years strong and counting. To many even today, it remains as one of the best, if not the best, fantasy experience of all time. I'm talking about Ultima Online, the MMORPG released in 1997 that was really the game that catapulted the interest in online multiplayer games. Borrowing a lot of mechanics and the level of interactivity from Ultima 7, Ultima Online allowed the player to truly play the role of any fantasy character you could possibly imagine. Not only a troll slayer warrior or a cunning wizard, but also a baker or a butcher, because the game allowed you to live from gathering and processing resources in a highly developed economy that is a monumental feat even for today. EverQuest might be the name that a lot of people relate to success in the old days of MMOs, and World of Warcraft is the undisputed winner of the later ages. But Ultima Online was the first true classic MMORPG as we know the genre to be, establishing many of the conventions that we still see today. And there you have it, a brief history of the Ultima series and its importance as one of the top icons of the games industry. It is hard for us to really internalize the impact of this franchise, especially if you didn't live the hype in the 80s and early 90s to really experience it firsthand. But know that few franchises in gaming history have been so prevalent and ubiquitous as Ultima. And myself as a game developer, still more than 40 years after the release of Ultima Zero, I feel that I personally have so much to learn from Richard Garriot and the Ultima series, and we as an industry will continue to see its impact for many years to come. Even if you are a young, modern gamer that doesn't see so much of the appeal in these good old games, I urge you to try any of the Ultima games and see it for yourself. I guarantee you that you will not play any other RPG the same way after that. Alright guys, that was the first episode of a brief history of video games. I hope you guys enjoyed it. It was so fun for me to do that, and I'm excited for what is next. Leave in the comments below what other classic games you want me to cover here in the channel. I'm looking forward to it, and I'll catch you guys next time.